Oh, hey everybody. Welcome back to Talk Gnosis Season 8 after a year and a half break. We actually have two recorded shows in the bag, so this is sort of a weird way to start the new season. It wasn't really planned, though we were planning on doing monthly um, live streams. But with all of us stuck in the house and with all of you stuck in the house, we'll probably be looking into doing this perhaps even weekly, depending on what's going on in the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm Deacon Jonathan Stewart of the Apostolic Johannite Church, and with us we have Bishop Laney.
Hi.
Hey, Bishop Laney. So I think the last time you and I co-hosted a show was 2014. Has anything happened since then?
A lot has happened since then. Although I will say that Father Tony and I did co-host a show back in 2016 on Gurdjieff.
Ah, yes.
I was brought in as a special guest host, but now I'm back with Talk Gnosis on a full-time basis. It's great to be back with everybody. And yeah, a lot's been happening. But I'm glad I'm here. And now, of course, we're in the midst of a global emergency.
Yeah, exactly. And also with us is a special guest, Jason Memel. He is a writer. He is a theater guy. Jason, you introduce yourself.
I'm a writer. I'm a theater director and an artistic director for a professional company here in Calgary, Alberta. An esoteric explorer, I suppose, and overall dreamer.
Precisely. So, as you probably already noticed, we aim for a chill, conversational, laid-back feeling in our normal show, but this is going to be extra laid-back.
Very laid back.
Very extremely laid-back. We're just going to talk about some of our favorite end-of-the-world apocalyptic literature, particularly pieces that may have connections to mysticism and Gnosticism. I love to ramble, so I better not start. Who wants to go?
I got some stuff, but I mean, it's up, whatever. Okay. All right. So I have some suggestions here, first of all, for everybody. First of all, there is the old classic, Stephen King's The Stand.
Yes.
Oh, geez, yeah.
100%.
And I mean, come on, folks. I mean, you can't really beat this one because it involves a pandemic.
Yeah.
Exactly. And one of the things I always really liked about it was that it describes how society falls apart in the very beginning. It's not, that people don't necessarily grasp how things fall apart. And he does, Stephen King does a masterful job with that. But then after everything falls apart, there's kind of the surviving people, which is about, I think, 1% of the planet. They kind of brace themselves and they come together for a standoff between good and evil. Stephen King, it was published back in the 70s, and then I think it was in the 90s that a revised version of The Stand came out, which is the one that I've read, in which he added about 1,000 more pages to the story because the publishers originally had cut it down to size, but when he had really kind of made this name for himself, he came back and he added all this text. So it's a massive tome. But I think it's really quite astonishing. And the idea behind The Stand, of course, is that you have ordinary, normal people who are called to take a stand.
Yeah.
And he kind of chronicles how these people who are just ordinary folks living their lives take some action and decide to make a stand for good. And even after these incredible losses. So The Stand, I think, is a perfect book to be reading right now. If that's the sort of thing that you're into, I think it's fantastic. Now, I did want to mention another classic duo of books, Octavia E. Butler's Parable of the Sower and the Parable of the Talents.
Oh, I don't know those.
And yeah, Octavia E. Butler, she was a very well-known African-American science fiction writer, and she wrote this dystopian, post-apocalyptic quasi-fiction, which included, and I think she wrote this stuff, I want to say it was back in the 80s or 90s, I think, that she wrote these. But they included, for example, an American president who ran on the slogan of "Make America Great Again."
Okay, so utter fiction, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and also outbreaks of the measles. Can
Ah.
and saying, can you believe it? The measles, people were getting the measles. Well, what was happening before COVID-19? Our friends, the anti-vaxxers, were bringing measles back.
Well,
You know,
we didn't tell you that the new season's an anti-vax season. Oh, that's embarrassing. No, that's a
we're
joke.
gonna have
It's a
some
joke,
talks about
everybody.
this. We're gonna have some talks. But and so what this is about people, again, ordinary people who have come together. And in this case, they form an intentional community. There is a definite sci-fi aspect to it that I won't share too much about, unlike Stephen King stuff. But in the parable of the sower and parable of the talents, you again see people who are coming together to resist an oppressive fascistic government while also dealing with the breakdown of society.
Yeah.
And so if people are looking for something that, well, maybe brings some things to mind, I definitely recommend those two books. And the final one that I recommend is an absolutely fantastic book. I'm going to try and bring it up here on Scribd. By the way, Scribd right now, which is an ebook library, they are offering their service for free right now. So there's no cost
Oh,
to
wow.
get a Scribd.com membership. They have audiobooks as well as regular books. I'm going to put this up here. Severance by Ling Ma. It's an award-winning book, which is about essentially a fungal infection that comes over from China. And it's called, and it creates a condition called Sheng fever. And people essentially become zombified versions of themselves. They lose their cognitive ability after having some symptoms like cold symptoms, and they're all wearing N95 masks, by the way. And they all lose their cognitive ability and essentially go through their daily routines, but eventually die of starvation and dehydration because they're not actually caring for themselves. They're just kind of going through the motions.
Yeah.
And the protagonist in this book is a woman who is, first of all, she's a blogger. She starts to chronicle all of what's going on in New York while the Sheng fever is taking hold. She continues to work and eventually heads on out, and she's rescued, or so-called rescued, by a group of young people who are heading off to Chicago or a Chicago suburb to start a new world in a new uh, compound there. And she finds that things are not exactly as they seem, but it is a contemporary post-apocalyptic book that involves an infection, a pandemic coming out of China. Wow. But it's a great deal of fun to read, and both the audiobook and the book itself can be found on Scribd for free this month.
Wow, I'm going to get all those suggestions. I have read The Stand, the long version. In many ways, I think it is, Stephen King's masterpiece, which is, why it's so long. And there is a really bad made-for-TV version from the 90s with Molly Ringwald, other celebrities
Gary Sinise,
Gary
James Sheridan,
Sinise,
Rob Lowe,
the dad from Alf.
The dad from Alf.
I'm trying to remember who else. But
just imagining the dad from Elf watching this and crying.
Yes.
I have
Sorry, Dad from Elf. But I find it to be, in some ways, a very Gnostic work. It's very dualistic. The Judeo-Christian God and some sort of personification of evil forces face off. And then when you kind of read the expanded Stephen King universe, he actually works to stand into some other works which have a much more Gnostic cosmology, right? There's a demiurgical figure who runs the Dark Tower, which is where all the different levels of reality are tucked into each other. So yeah, it's a great work. It does tie into Gnosticism as well, and I'm definitely going to get the other books that Bishop Laney mentioned. So I'll go next. I'm going to talk about the works of Alan Moore and Grant Morrison, and that's a joke. Jason, do you want to go next?
I was like, okay, I guess I'll just sit here, I suppose. So yeah, well, the last time I was on here was to talk about Alan Moore and Grant Morrison, but I think specifically in this case about how both of their like really famous works, or maybe not famous works, but prominent works, end in apocalypses.
Yes.
The Grant Morrison's Invisibles is a like a sort of a cyberpunk, just punk in general, comics adventure where it's a group of freedom fighters fighting against the archonic forces that are ruling the world. But interestingly, it does end in an apocalypse in which even those archons are shown just to be part of the story.
Yeah.
And that like it really has it has one of the best endings, I think, in comics, because it just to spoil it, but I would say spoiling the ending does nothing to spoil the rest of the story. It's still worth reading every page. But the end of the story is the main character who was the prophesied Buddha saying that that he realized that all of this was just a story, and now the sentence is up, like literally the sentence of our imprisonment, but also the sentence that he is speaking, and it just zooms in to the period on that sentence, and then zooms past the period to white space.
Yeah.
So that's truly like an apocalyptic ending because it ends into nothing, but also a certain freedom in that nothing.
Yep.
And then with Alan Moore's Promethea, I think was an interesting difference is that Promethea was this tour through Western esotericism and magic. He goes through all the court cards and the tarot. He goes to every sphere of the Sephiroth and the Tree of Life.
Oh, sorry to interrupt, Jason. It's also a superhero story too, right? Like Promethea is a mix of Sophia from the Gnostic myth and Wonder Woman, basically. So it's in the structure of a superhero story, but you're also getting a whole course in Western esotericism, right?
Yes, that's right. I think I jumped to the part I was most excited by because it starts out and it does feel more or less like a superhero story that has these supernatural or magical elements built in, and then it just leans heavily into that, and then you're doing a tour through the Kabbalah, which is amazing. But actually, it's worth pointing out that the way a lot of superheroes like they change from their day-to-day life to their magical or their superhero life involves them going into a phone booth or putting on a special ring. What's interesting about Promethea is that she becomes she is essentially brought into being when Sophia learns about Promethea as a literary figure and then writes about her, and in the act of writing about her becomes her.
Yes.
And so this is also Alan Moore's sort of doorway into talking about the imaginal realm and the conceptual realm of things, which is where I think he finds a lot of magic really lives.
Yes.
But what I think is to jump all the way to the apocalypse, because I don't want to just synopsize the whole book, is that essentially the book ends in the end of the world. There's a lot of prophecies of people who are against Promethea who are worried that she's going to end the world, and she's like, well, you're right, I am. That's actually my job. But her end of the world is essentially like a mass illumination for everybody. Like everybody just gets a light switch flick of Buddha enlightenment, and then everybody's great. Everybody's good together. Also, this sort of opening, this enlightenment, has also unlocked the doors of the imaginal realm as well. So now you have fiction and reality living side by side very harmoniously. But what I think is most fascinating is that he also depicts what the day after the apocalypse looks like in this magical apocalypse, and it's just another day. And some of the characters actually comment on it. It's like, I didn't expect I'd still have to go to the bathroom after the apocalypse.
Well, that's
exactly.
Why they have the runs on toilet paper.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that from a Gnostic perspective, I think that was really sort of a fascinating way of looking at not just that notion of seeing how enlightenment or an apocalypse is often a transcending of the world that we're in, but also that is not. It's an apocalypse, but it's not actually an end. There's no there's no concise way in which the narrative comfortably closes and we all get to go back to our dressing rooms in the afterlife. There's still a next day that we still have to deal with.
Yeah, it's a very Gnostic work, much, just like the Invisibles. These are very deliberately Gnostic works, right? They're reading Gnostic texts, they're working in Gnostic themes, they're bringing in other elements of mysticism and esotericism. But his Apocalypse is very Gnostic because what he calls the immateria is basically, for you fellow Gnostic nerds at home, what the Gnostics call the pleroma, the wholeness, the fullness, the world that's immaterial but more real than matter. And in that text, there's kind of a duality between the physical and the imaginative. And the physical sort of traps the imaginative, right? It covers it over. It pushes it down. It oppresses it. It's a cage for imagination. But of course, what happens in the Apocalypse is not the destruction of matter, but instead a union, a marriage.
Exactly.
Where, just like you said, right? Like the next day, there's this great inbreaking of imagination, of immateria. But there's another day, and both matter and spirit live together in a new kind of harmony.
There's almost like a connection to that. Is it? I don't know. I'm not going to guess where the provenance of the quote is, but it's something like about a young monk and an old monk talking, and the young monk asks him what he did before he became enlightened, and he said, "Chop wood, carry water." And then, what did you do after you were enlightened? Chop wood, carry water. That there's something, like that. It's which is, I think, also a healthy thing to remember, is that it isn't necessarily an escape. I think sometimes sometimes apocalypses, and particularly like apocalypses that are just dour, just negative, are actually attractive because they're at least a concise ending. We get to go like, okay, that's an end, that's a finish. Whereas it's more maybe braver to wonder what it's like to have to keep going in it.
Yeah. Well, it's, when you look at the book of the Apocalypse, Revelation, the ending is not everybody dies and goes to heaven, right? It's a new world is built where God lives with his creation here on earth, and he lives with his creation. And I think it ends, I guess I should have looked this quote up before I did this, but he wipes people's tears away with his own hands, right? There's a new union between human and the divine, and of course that might be metaphorical, but it's not we rolled everything up and it's over and now we're up in heaven, right? It's a new creation is how the Bible ends. To go along with Promethea, and I guess spoilers, but there's also Alan Moore's dark, the Promethea is very very positive, right? Very uplifting, very enlightening. And he has a very similar work, which is the dark side of that, called Providence, which is based off the work of H.P. Lovecraft. Spoiler alert, it actually has the exact same ending, but it's a dark ending, right? The immateria breaks through, but the immateria is dark, right?
It's the dark imaginings.
It's the dark imaginings.
Yeah. Although, the interesting thing actually, so the Lovecraft perspective is that these aliens are not actually, they're not even evil. They're just so much bigger and weirder than we are that we don't have a moral framework that can hold them. And that's actually the thing reading Providence, is that like it's bad for the main character. It's terrible for the main character. But it's such like that ending doesn't feel like a horror ending. It feels more like a existential ending,
Yes.
And if maybe so if maybe Promethea's end is that of a world where matter and imaginary commingle harmoniously, then I suppose maybe the dark ending is simply that that we're just overrun by imagination. We're overrun by the imaginal, to the point where we've lost any grounding whatsoever.
Yeah. 100%. I think that's a really great way of thinking about it, and that's actually something that we've talked about, Jason, or one one of my first spiritual teachers ever sort of taught me is that it's important to actually stay grounded with all this stuff, right? Because if you don't, this individual, his marriage actually fell apart because he was so busy doing all these Gnostic activities, right? So busy doing all these lodges and these esoteric orders that he was neglecting to stay grounded. And it really affected his life. And that was literally the first thing he told me, is that, you have to have your feet on the ground to have your head in the stars. So so that might be a lesson in that Alan Moore work.
Well, and if I may try to draw a little bit of a parallel to the world we're dealing with right now too, is that like arguably like the reason people are hoarding toilet paper is because they have been overcome by an imaginary problem that doesn't correspond to their physical reality. Yep. There's definitely a pandemic, but there's definitely not a supply chain problem for toilet paper. So, the implication that because there's a pandemic that we're going to go into a post-apocalyptic war zone, and that you need to stockpile is them, like, I think is people letting that dark imagining seep in a little.
Of course. Listeners and viewers, if you click the Amazon link below this video, you can purchase a bidet. And for every sale of a bidet, a small amount will go towards Talk Gnosis. So I highly recommend it. You don't have to worry about this toilet paper issue any longer.
We've solved it for you. This is going to put a new meaning to the phrase of streaming shows.
Oh.
I'm sorry.
Okay, so I guess I'll talk about a work which is actually one of the most best-selling books of all time. Still in print, still a bestseller, and it's Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose. For those who aren't familiar with it, I won't give a spoiler for the ending because it's actually a murder mystery. But it's a murder mystery that takes place in the late medieval period. It's about two monks, William of Baskerville and Adso, who's sort of they're sort of Holmes and Watson, right? William is older and wiser, and Adso is sort of the Watson asking the questions. And they arrive at a monastery or an abbey. Because there's going to be these trials to look into heresy, and it's a philosophical reflection on meaning, on existence, on heresy, on beliefs, on the meaning of stories again, of what texts actually are and how they interact with each other. But all that said, it's wrapped up in a very gripping murder mystery. So it's a very intelligent book. It's a very deep book, but it's a very fun read. And it has an apocalyptic background because there's a lot of people at the time who actually think the world's going to end soon. And then the murderer, he kills, he or she, they kill 7 people. And the methods of killing the 7 people equal the 7 trumpets and the 7 plagues and bad things that happen in the book of Revelation. So, for instance, there's an ocean of blood in after one of the trumpets is sounded out in the book of Revelation, so somebody is drowned in a bucket of pig's blood. So it directly connects to the apocalypse. And for the Gnostic background, some of the heresies are Gnostic and mystical heresies that are sort of the background to the book. So if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. Again, it's a page turner, but it's a really special book where you get to have that bit of guilty fun and really get a good dose of philosophy. And there is a new mini-series coming out. There is a movie that was made in the 80s, but I haven't seen it. I'm not sure if it's good. Holler at me if it is. But I believe the new mini-series is supposed to come out this year. So, and it's going to be, it's a long book. So it's the movie's only 2 hours, but I think the mini-series is going to be like 10 hours.
Name of the Rose, season 1. It came out in 2019. John Turturro, Rupert Everett.
Oh, perfect. I didn't even realize it was out. So there we go. I've got my quarantine binge watching.
You can find it Prime Video with if you can watch it with Sundance Now.
Okay, awesome.
So yeah.
And then the other book I'll mention quickly, which is directly a spiritual book, is called The Apocalypse Unsealed, and it comes from the early 20th century.
Oh,
and it's
yeah.
Yeah, there's some serious problems with it, but there's a lot of insight. It is written by a mystic in the early 20th century who started the Gnostic Society in L.A., which later led to great things. And the book is an inner interpretation of the book of the Apocalypse in the Bible, the Revelation, and he sees it as what happens to an individual when you're doing so much spiritual work that the ego is destroyed, right, and a new self is created. It's so catastrophic that it's like the world ending. It's an inner experience. So there's a lot in there that is very insightful and very cool. He actually even notices some things that I think some scholars would find interesting. The famous 666. He actually finds a 111, a 222, a 333, a 444, a 555, the famous 666, a 777, an 888, a 999, a 101010. And his case for these are very, very convincing. And of course, this is the progress up until enlightenment, right? So when you hit 666, you're encountering a lot of resistance, inner resistance from the inner antichrist, right? The ego that wants to hold on and not become a new self. That said, it is a bit of a problematic book because he was sort of part of the new age of his time. He's bringing in a lot of ideas from the East that he doesn't really understand very well. A lot of ideas from Hinduism. Yeah, go figure. That he doesn't understand very well, and he's applying them, and there's some really bad sort of etymologies, and it's a very early 20th century text, right, written by a white American guy who doesn't have much experiences outside of extensive reading. But that said, it's free online. It's even though it's from that time period where sometimes reading books from that time period are a bit of a slog, it actually moves along at a good clip. It's quite readable, but you take it with a healthy dose of salt.
Yeah, I just found it, in fact, on archive.org. So the Internet Archive has it. So yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, so we're almost done, huh? We wanted to do about a half an hour. So we're just about there. But is there anything else you folks wanted to chat about, or any closing words?
I have a couple of just like things that I think are maybe neat to check out that I think people who are interested in this will probably also find interesting. William S. Burroughs had a performance piece. A lot of his work was essentially performance. I think that was just called Apocalypse. And I haven't checked, but I wouldn't be surprised if you put William S. Burroughs and Apocalypse into YouTube, you'd probably find a performance. I would just put that out there because it's like what we've been talking about. He kind of describes this world that's becoming unmoored from its meaning, which is just really like a neat listen. And then there's a book that I haven't read, but I think I've heard come up a lot called A Paradise Built in Hell: The Extraordinary Communities That Arise in Disaster by Rebecca Solnit. And this is a book about like basically how it's the opposite of what we tend to think about when there's a crisis. We tend to think that, like when the power goes out, our neighbor's going to come by and kill us. But instead, what's actually more likely is that they're going to come by and bring their food so that they can grill it for us.
Yeah. I work as a volunteer in my Chicago's community emergency response team, and we learn a lot about what we are is we're basically civilians who are trained to assist with disaster and emergency management. And that's exactly what does happen. And one book that I was going to recommend, it's not of a Gnostic nature, but it's called The Unthinkable: Who Survives When Disaster Strikes and Why, by Amanda Ripley. Now, the book is about 11 years old, but it's basically a very readable survey for the layperson about how about disaster management and emergency management in the U.S. Where are the failures? What are things that people need to learn about? If you want some insight as to what's going on with the current pandemic from a disaster management perspective, you could do a lot worse than read this book. It's definitely worth it. It's available through Amazon. It's on Kindle. It's absolutely fantastic. It's a pretty searing indictment of the way countries handle disaster management, particularly the United States. But I think it will give you some insight as to what is actually going on here and what can be done in the future to improve things.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to get that right away. So
yeah, please do. It's great.
Yeah.
Well, I hope we've given our listeners a bunch of books to add to their quarantine pile.
I mean, I'm glad we did this because I have a bunch of books to add to my quarantine pile, so I'm quite happy about this. So, so I guess that's it, folks. Stay safe. You keep your eyes peeled to the Talk Noses channel and to our social media. We are going to be putting out the tape shows. We're going to be doing more live stuff. Feel free to get in touch with us, give us feedback. If you need someone to talk to, I can't offer any counseling, right? I'm not a trained counselor. I have taken courses in active listening, so I can be there for you, but I can't give you any advice or counseling. But if you do need someone, you can reach out, and there are lots of resources out there. I know that it is scary times at the moment, but I'm sure we will all get through this together. That was a much deeper note that I meant to end on, but read those books and have a great night.
All right, take care, folks.
Can I actually end with how our Calgary mayor has been ending his speeches?
Please.
And this is just very specific to the time we're in. Clean hands, clear heads, open hearts.
Absolutely.
Perfect.
Yeah. Well, that's it for me.
Okay. Good night. Yeah. Good luck. Godspeed.
Take care.